Hi everybody, and a very warm welcome to Institute of Finance Education Now. This is Moya Kihuba with yet another video podcast, and as always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we'll look at the types of errors we make in hypothesis testing. On a previous video that I did, we looked at 4 steps to hypothesis testing. Perhaps if you've not watched that video, you could do it before you proceed, and the link to the video is on the video description below. In the 4th step, we decide whether to retain or reject the null hypothesis. Because you're observing a sample and not the entire population, it's possible to make a conclusion that may be wrong. The decision can either be correct, that is correctly reject or retain a null hypothesis, or it could be wrong, that is incorrectly reject or retain a null hypothesis. We investigate each decision alternative in the subsequent section. Since we will observe a sample and not a population, it is not possible to know for sure the truth in the population. So for the sake of the illustration, we'll assume we know this. This assumption is labeled in the population table, is labeled as truth in the population table. We'll introduce each decision alternative next. Now, the decision to retain the null hypothesis can be correct or incorrect. The correct decision is to retain a true null hypothesis. This is called a null result or a null finding. This is usually an interesting decision because the decision is to retain what we already assumed, that the value stated in the null hypothesis is correct. For this reason, null results alone are rarely published in behavioral research. The incorrect decision is to retain a false null hypothesis. The decision is an example of a type 2 error or a beta error. With each test we make, there's always some probability that the decision should be type 2 error. In this decision, we decide to retain previous notions of truth that are in fact false. While it is an error, we still do nothing. We retain the null hypothesis. We can always go back and check by conducting more studies. Therefore, a type 2 error or a beta error is the probability of retaining a null hypothesis that is actually false. We can also make a decision to reject the null hypothesis. When we reject the null hypothesis, we can be correct or incorrect. The correct decision is to reject a false null hypothesis. There's always some probability that when we decide that the null hypothesis is false, that the null hypothesis is false when it is indeed false. This decision is called the power of the decision making. It is called power because it is the decision we aim for. Remember that you're only testing the null hypothesis because we think it is wrong. Deciding to reject a false null hypothesis then is the power, in as much as we learn the most about the population when we accurately reject false notion about the decision. This decision is the most published result in the behavioral finance. And maybe I could re-emphasize, the power in the hypothesis testing is the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis. Specifically, it is the probability that a randomly selected sample will show that the null hypothesis is false when the null hypothesis is indeed false. We can still make an incorrect decision. The incorrect decision is to reject a true null hypothesis. This decision is an example of a type 1 error. With each test we make, there's always some probability that our decision is a type 1 error. A researcher who makes this error decides to reject previous notions of the truth that are in fact true. Making this type of error is very similar to finding an innocent person guilty. To minimize this error, we assume that the defendant is innocent when we begin the trial. Similarly, to minimize making type 1 error, we assume the null hypothesis is true when we begin a hypothesis test. Since we assume the null hypothesis is true, we can control type 1 error, by stating a level of significance. The level we set, called alpha level, is the largest probability of committing a type 1 error that will always allow and still decide to reject the null hypothesis. This criterion is usually set at 0.5, that is alpha is equal to 0.05, and we compare the alpha level to the value of p. When the probability of type 1 error is less than 5%, that is p is less than 0.05, we decide to reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, we retain the null hypothesis. In summary, type 1 error is probability of rejecting a null hypothesis that is actually true. Researchers directly control for the probability of committing this error. An alpha level is the level of significance or the criterion for the hypothesis test. It is the largest probability of committing a type 1 error that will allow and still decide to reject the null hypothesis. That's the end. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I shall see you next time. Bye-bye.